They found her wedding dress hanging in the abandoned farmhouse 70 years later, still white, still perfect, still waiting. But when they found his letters hidden beneath the floorboards, letters written in his own blood, the historians realized this wasn't just another tragic love story from the American frontier. This was something far darker, something that would make you question whether love could survive when it crossed a line that should never be crossed. This is the true story of Margaret Hayes and Thomas Blackwood, and I warn you, by the end, you will understand why some love stories are meant to be forgotten. The promise. The Iowa soil was unforgiving in the summer of 1883, but Margaret Hayes had learned long ago that survival meant being more stubborn than the land itself. At 23, she had already buried both her parents, her mother to consumption, her father to a farming accident that left him broken beneath an overturned wagon. The small homestead outside Cedar Rapids was hers now, all 60 acres of it, along with debts that multiplied like locusts and a future that seemed to narrow with each passing season. She was washing clothes in the creek behind the property when she first saw him. Thomas Blackwood rode a black mare that moved like water over stone, and he sat in the saddle with the kind of easy confidence that came from a life spent outdoors. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds. Margaret knew she should have been frightened, a woman alone, a strange man on her property, but something in his face stopped her fear before it could take root. "Ma'am," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that seemed almost old-fashioned even then. "I don't mean to intrude. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back, and I was hoping you might direct me to the nearest blacksmith." His voice was educated, refined, not the rough frontier drawl she was accustomed to. Margaret stood slowly, conscious of her wet hands and the worn fabric of her dress. "Nearest blacksmith is in town about 8 miles east," she said. "But your mare won't make it that far on 3 shoes, not in this heat." Thomas looked down at his horse, then back at Margaret with something that might have been respect. "You know horses. I know suffering when I see it," Margaret replied. "I've got tools in the barn. My father was handy with metalwork. If you've got the patience, I can probably manage a temporary fix." That's how it started, not with romance or passion, but with practical necessity and mutual respect. Thomas led his mare to the barn, while Margaret gathered her father's old blacksmithing tools, and for the next 2 hours they worked together in companionable silence. He held the horse steady while she examined the hoof, heated the shoe in the forge her father had built, and hammered it into place with steady, practiced strokes. "You're remarkable," Thomas said when she finished, and there was no flattery in his voice, only honest observation. Margaret wiped the sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of soot across her cheek. "I'm practical. Remarkable doesn't keep you fed." He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "May I at least offer you dinner as payment?" "There's an inn in town that I'm told serves decent food." She should have said no. A respectable woman didn't accept dinner invitations from strangers, no matter how well-mannered they seemed. But Margaret had been alone for so long, and there was something in Thomas Blackwood's eyes that made her want to say yes, a loneliness that mirrored her own, a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with food. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. That dinner turned into another and another. Thomas, it turned out, was a land surveyor from Boston, traveling through Iowa to map territory for the railroad companies that were spreading west like iron veins across the continent. He was educated at Harvard, well-read, articulate, everything Margaret's hard frontier life was not, but he never made her feel less than. Instead, he seemed fascinated by her strength, her resilience, the way she could birth a calf and mend a fence and keep an entire farm running with nothing but determination and calloused hands. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he told her one evening, as they sat on her porch, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson. Everyone back east thinks strength is about money or education or social position, but real strength is what you have, Margaret, the ability to keep going when everything tells you to give up. She turned to look at him, this elegant man who seemed so out of place on her rough wooden porch, and felt her heart do something dangerous. "Why are you really here, Thomas? A man like you could have anyone. Why waste your time with a dirt-poor farm girl who can barely read?" He reached for her hand, his fingers gentle, despite the calluses she could feel there. Because you're real. Everything and everyone back in Boston is a performance, a carefully constructed lie. But you, Margaret, you're honest all the way through. Do you know how rare that is? The courtship that followed was unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined. Thomas would arrive at dawn to help with the farm work, his fine clothes quickly becoming as dusty and worn as her own. He taught her to read better, bringing books from town and spending evenings by lamplight showing her worlds beyond Iowa, Shakespeare and Dickens, poetry and philosophy. She taught him about the land, about reading weather patterns and understanding animal behavior, about the 1,000 small skills that meant survival on the frontier. 3 months after their first meeting, he proposed. They were in the barn, of all places, delivering a foal from Margaret's aging mare. It was a difficult birth, and Margaret was elbow-deep in blood and fluid, her face set in concentration as she worked to turn the breech foal. Thomas held the mare's head, speaking softly to calm her, and when Margaret finally pulled the wet, trembling foal free and heard its first shaky breath, she looked up to find Thomas staring at her with something like awe. "Marry me," he said. Margaret sat back on her heels, still holding the newborn foal. "What?" "Marry me, Margaret Hayes. I know it's fast. I know I should court you properly for a year and ask your father's permission, but he's gone and you don't need anyone's permission anyway. I love you. I love your strength and your honesty and the way you bring life into this world with your bare hands. Marry me." She should have asked questions. Should have wanted to know about his family, his prospects, his plans for the future. But Margaret had learned that life on the frontier didn't reward hesitation. You took your chances when they came, or you watched them disappear over the horizon. "Yes," she said simply. They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit preacher who happened through town. Margaret wore a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Thomas bought in Cedar Rapids, simple white cotton with lace at the collar, nothing fancy but clean and new. Thomas wore his best suit, and when he slipped the gold ring onto her finger, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents died: hope. The wedding night was tender and awkward and sweet. Thomas was patient with her inexperience, gentle in ways that made her understand that his love was genuine. They made a bed in the hayloft of the barn, cooler than the house in the summer heat, and fell asleep tangled together while the horses shifted peacefully below. For 3 months, Margaret lived in a kind of dream. Thomas continued his surveying work, but he always came home to her at night. They worked the farm together, planned for the future, talked about children and expansion and all the beautiful ordinary things that married couples discussed. He was still contracted to the railroad for another 6 months, but after that he promised he would stay permanently. They would build a real life together. "I've never been this happy," Margaret told him one night as they lay in the darkness. "I didn't know it was possible to feel this way." Thomas pulled her closer, his breath warm against her hair. "Neither did I. You saved me, Margaret. I was so lost before I met you. Going through motions, playing a part. You gave me a reason to be real." But there were small things that troubled her. Little inconsistencies that she tried to ignore. The way Thomas would sometimes wake screaming from nightmares he refused to discuss. The occasional letters that arrived addressed to T. Blackwood that he would read and immediately burn. The peculiar scars she discovered on his back one night. Thin, precise lines that looked almost deliberate. "What happened to you?" she asked, tracing the scars with gentle fingers. Thomas went rigid under her touch. "Nothing. An accident when I was young." "Thomas, please, Margaret, don't ask. Some things are better left buried." She let it go because she loved him, because their happiness seemed too fragile to test with difficult questions. But the doubts planted seeds in her mind, small and dark and waiting. The first real crack appeared 4 months into their marriage. Margaret was in town buying supplies when she overheard 2 women talking outside the general store. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but her name caught her attention. Poor thing doesn't even know, does she? Someone should tell her. It's not right letting her live in ignorance like that. And say what? "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband isn't who you think he is." She'd never believe it. Love makes fools of us all. Margaret's hands went cold. She stepped around the corner facing the 2 women directly. "What are you talking about?" The women exchanged glances, embarrassed to be caught gossiping. The older one, Mrs. Patterson, had the grace to look ashamed. "Nothing, dear. Just idle talk. About my And the younger woman, Sarah Miller, bit her lip. Then, with the reckless courage of someone who believed they were doing the right thing, she spoke. "There was a man through here last week. From Boston. He was asking questions about Thomas Blackwood." Margaret's heart began to pound. What kind of questions? About where he was staying, how long he'd been here, whether he was— Sarah hesitated. "Whether he was alone. What did you tell him?" "The truth. That Mr. Blackwood had married you and was living on your farm." Mrs. Patterson put a hand on Margaret's arm. "The man said something strange when we told him. He said, 'Then God help that poor woman,' and he left town immediately, heading east." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "Did he say anything else? Give any reason?" "No. But Margaret, dear, do you know anything about your husband's past, his family? Why a man like him would be out here instead of back in Boston where he belongs?" She didn't. The realization struck her like a physical blow. She knew almost nothing about Thomas Blackwood's life before Iowa, before her. She had been so grateful for the love and companionship, so desperate not to be alone anymore, that she had never pressed for details. "I'm sure it's nothing," Margaret said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Thank you for telling me." She rode home in a daze, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. When she arrived at the farm, she found Thomas in the barn, repairing a section of fence. He looked up as she approached, and his smile was so genuine, so full of love, that her doubts wavered. "You're back early," he said, setting down his tools. "Is everything all right? Thomas, I need you to tell me the truth about something." His expression shifted, became cautious. "About what? Who are you?" "Really? A man from Boston came through town asking about you. He said—" She swallowed hard. "He said God help that poor woman when he found out we were married." The color drained from Thomas's face. For a long moment he just stood there, frozen, and Margaret watched a dozen different emotions cross his features. Fear, anger, grief, resignation. "I knew this would happen eventually," he said quietly. "I just hoped we'd have more time." "More time before what? Thomas, you're scaring me." He took a step toward her, hands outstretched, and she saw that they were shaking. "Margaret, I love you. You have to believe that. Everything between us has been real, the most real thing in my entire life." "Then tell me the truth." Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with such pain that Margaret almost told him to stop, that she didn't need to know. Almost. "My name is Thomas Blackwood. That part is true. I am from Boston. I did go to Harvard, but I'm not here as a land surveyor for the railroad." He paused, gathering himself. "I'm here because I'm running from something. Someone. Who? My wife." The word hit Margaret like a gunshot. She actually staggered backward, her hand going to her chest as if she could physically hold her breaking heart together. You're married." "Was. Am. I don't know anymore." Thomas was talking faster now, words tumbling out like he'd been holding them back for months. "Her name is Elizabeth. We were married for 5 years. It was arranged by our families, old bossed. On money, you understand. I didn't love her, and she didn't love me, but we played our parts. Until what?" Thomas's hands were fists at his sides, and Margaret could see him struggling with something enormous, something that terrified him. "Until I discovered what she was, what her entire family was. I don't understand. They're not human, Margaret. Not entirely. There's something wrong with them, something in their blood that's been there for generations. They look like us, they talk like us, but underneath—" He was shaking now, his voice rising. "I saw things in that house, rituals in the cellar. Elizabeth would disappear for days and come back with blood under her fingernails and a smile on her face. I found journals belonging to her grandmother, to her great-grandmother, going back centuries. They documented things, Margaret. Horrible things." Margaret wanted to call him mad, to say he was having some kind of breakdown. But the absolute conviction in his voice, the genuine terror in his eyes, made her hesitate. "What kind of things?" "Sacrifices. Children, mostly. They would steal them from immigrant families, people who wouldn't be believed if they reported a missing child. They would bring them to the house and—" He stopped, his face twisting with nausea. "I tried to leave. I tried to go to the police. But the family has power, money and influence and connections to people who make problems disappear. I realized the only way to escape was to vanish completely. To come west where they couldn't find me. So you lied to me. Margaret's voice was flat, cold. You married me knowing you already had a wife. Knowing that you were putting me in I thought I'd lost them. I've been moving for 2 years, never staying anywhere long enough to be tracked. But then I met you, and for the first time, I wanted to stop running. I wanted a real life, a real chance at happiness. I hoped, that they would never find me here. But they have. Thomas nodded miserably. If that man from Boston was asking about me, it means Elizabeth knows where I am. She'll be coming, Margaret. She'll be coming for me and anyone associated with me. Margaret felt like she was drowning, like the entire world had tilted, and she was sliding off the edge into darkness. This is insane. You realize how insane this sounds? I know. God, I know. But Margaret, I'm telling you the truth. Elizabeth Blackwood is not human, and she will kill you without a second thought if she believes you stand between her and me. You need to leave. Tonight. Take whatever money we have and go California, Oregon, anywhere far from here. Leave. Thomas, this is my home. My land. I'm not running from some fantasy you've created because you feel guilty about. It's not a fantasy. His shout made her jump. I'm trying to save your life. They stood there in the barn, staring at each other across a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. Margaret felt the foundation of her entire world crumbling. 4 months ago, she had been alone but stable, struggling but surviving. Then Thomas Blackwood had ridden into her life with his gentle hands and educated voice, and she had allowed herself to believe in fairy tales. Now she understood that some fairy tales had monsters. I need time to think, she said finally. I need you to leave me alone or... Now. Thomas's face crumpled. Margaret, please. Go, Thomas. Just go. He left the barn, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and Margaret sank down onto a hay bale with her head in her hands. She had been a fool, a desperate, lonely fool who had traded common sense for companionship. But even as anger and betrayal warred in her chest, a small voice whispered that she had seen the love in Thomas's eyes, had felt it in every touch. Whatever else he had lied about, she didn't believe he had lied about that. The question was, did love matter when it was built on deception? She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat on the porch with her father's rifle across her lap, watching the darkness and trying to decide what she believed. Thomas stayed in the barn, respecting her need for space, but she could see the lamplight burning there all night. He wasn't sleeping either. Dawn came gray and cold, unusual for August. Margaret was making coffee when she heard the horse. A single rider approaching from the east, moving with purpose. Margaret set down the coffee pot and picked up the rifle, stepping out onto the porch. The rider was still too far away to make out clearly, but she could see it was a woman, side saddle, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the morning light. Thomas appeared from the barn, and the expression on his face when he saw the approaching rider was pure terror. Get inside, he said urgently. Margaret, get inside and bar the door. Who is it? It's her, it's Elizabeth. The woman drew closer, and Margaret could make out details now. She was beautiful in a cold, classical way, pale skin, dark hair pulled back severely, features that might have been carved from marble. She rode a gray horse that moved with the same eerie grace as Thomas's black mare, and she was smiling. It was the smile that made Margaret believe, finally. It was wrong somehow, too wide, showing too many teeth. It was the smile of something that had learned to mimic human expression but had never quite perfected it. Elizabeth Blackwood reined in her horse about 20 feet from the porch. Her eyes, pale blue, almost colorless, moved from Thomas to Margaret and back again. Hello, husband, she said, and her voice was like honey poured over broken glass. You've led me on quite a chase. Thomas moved to stand between Elizabeth and Margaret, his body tense as a drawn bowstring. Leave her alone, Elizabeth. Your quarrel is with me. Quarrel? Elizabeth laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. Oh, Thomas, we don't have quarrels. We have games. And you've made this one so very entertaining. Her gaze shifted to Margaret. And who is this? Another woman foolish enough to believe in your sad, romantic story? Did he tell you he loved you? That you saved him? Margaret lifted the rifle, pointing it directly at Elizabeth's chest. Get off my land. Elizabeth's smile widened impossibly further. Brave. I like that. So much more interesting than the usual cowering and begging. She dismounted with fluid grace, and Margaret saw that despite her refined appearance, she moved like a predator, all coiled strength and controlled violence. Tell me, farm girl, did my Thomas mention that he belongs to me? That we were joined not just by law, but by blood and bone, an ancient covenant? You're insane, Margaret said, but her finger tightened. Ed on the trigger. Am I? Elizabeth took a step closer, and Margaret saw something shift in her eyes. A flicker of something inhuman, something that made her think of deep water and darker things beneath the surface. Shall I show you what I am? What my family has been for 17 generations? I could tear out your throat before you could pull that trigger, sweet girl. I could pull your husband's heart from his chest while he watches. I could do things to both of you that would make you beg for death. But you won't, Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that made both women look at him. You won't because you need me alive, Elizabeth. Whatever ritual your family requires, whatever dark purpose I serve, you need me breathing. Elizabeth's expression flickered with something that might have been annoyance. Clever boy. Still putting pieces together even after all this time. Yes, you're correct. I need you alive and relatively intact, but I don't need her. She gestured dismissively at Margaret. She's nothing, a distraction, a toy you picked up to amuse yourself during your little rebellion. She's my wife, Thomas said firmly. You already have a wife. Not anymore. I left you, Elizabeth. That life is over. Nothing is over until I say it's over. The rage in Elizabeth's voice made the air itself seem to vibrate. The smile was gone now, replaced by something cold and terrible. You think you can simply walk away from me? From us? You swore oaths, Thomas. Blood oaths that can't be broken by simple distance or wishful thinking. Margaret's mind was reeling, trying to process what she was witnessing. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't exist outside of fairy tales and nightmares. But the rifle in her hands was real, and the woman standing in her yard was real, and the absolute conviction in Thomas's eyes when he said his wife was inhuman, that was real too. What do you want? Margaret heard herself ask. Elizabeth turned to her, and her expression softened into something almost pitying. I want my husband back. I want him to fulfill his obligations, and I want you to understand that sometimes, farm girl, love isn't enough. Sometimes the world is crueler and stranger than your simple mind can comprehend. My mind isn't simple, and I'm not afraid of you. It was a lie, but Margaret had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant pretending to be stronger than you were. She kept the rifle steady, kept her voice from shaking, and met Elizabeth Blackwood's inhuman gaze without flinching. For the first time, Elizabeth looked at her with something approaching respect. Perhaps Thomas chose better than I thought, she mused. You have spine, at least. Such a shame you'll have to die for it. Everything happened very fast after that. Elizabeth moved with impossible speed, closing the distance between them in a blur. Margaret fired the rifle, but Elizabeth twisted aside and the bullet went wide, splintering wood from the porch post. Then Elizabeth's hand was around Margaret's throat, lifting her off her feet with inhuman strength. Margaret clawed at the hand, choking her, feeling her vision start to dim. Through the gathering darkness, she saw Thomas tackle Elizabeth from behind, both of them crashing to the ground. The grip on her throat released and Margaret fell, gasping, her lungs burning as she sucked Ed in air. She looked up to see Thomas and Elizabeth struggling in the dirt. They moved too fast, too violently. This was no ordinary fight. Elizabeth's fingers elongated into something like claws, raking across Thomas's chest and drawing blood. He screamed and drove his elbow into her face, but she just laughed. That terrible bone chime sound. Margaret scrambled for the rifle, but it had fallen too far away. Instead, her hand closed around a piece of firewood stacked near the porch. Without thinking, without allowing herself to hesitate, she swung it at Elizabeth's head with all her strength. The impact made a sound like a melon splitting. Elizabeth went still and Thomas rolled free, blood streaming from the wounds on his chest. They both stared at Elizabeth's motionless form. Is she dead? Margaret whispered. Before Thomas could answer, Elizabeth's eyes opened. They were completely black, now, no white visible at all. and when she smiled, her teeth had become pointed, serrated like a shark's. "You gonna kill me with wood and stone, little farm girl," she said, her voice somehow deeper, resonating with harmonics that made Margaret's bones ache. "I am older than your grandfather's grandfather. I have drunk the blood of generations. I am—" Thomas grabbed the rifle Margaret had dropped and fired point blank into Elizabeth's face. The explosion was deafening. Elizabeth's head snapped back, and for a moment she went completely still. Then impossibly she began to laugh, a wet gurgling sound made horrible by the ruin of her lower jaw. "Iron," she said, the word distorted but comprehensible. "That tickles." Thomas's hand found Margaret's, squeezing desperately. "Run," he said. "Margaret, run as fast and far as you can." But Margaret Hayes had not survived orphanhood and poverty and frontier life by running from difficult things. She looked at the monster wearing a woman's face, at the man she loved despite his lies, and made a decision. "The barn," she said. "Follow me." They ran together, Elizabeth's laughter chasing them across the yard. Margaret could hear her pursuing, could hear the wet slap of her footsteps in the dirt, faster than any human should move. They reached the barn and Margaret slammed the door, throwing the bolt. "That one and hold her," Thomas said, pressing his hand to his bleeding chest. "I know." Margaret was moving through the barn with purpose, gathering items, a coil of rope, a can of kerosene, matches. "But we don't need to hold her for long, just long enough." Thomas understood immediately. His eyes widened. "Margaret, no. You'll lose everything." "I already did. The moment I married a man who was already married. The moment I believed in fairy tales." She was dumping kerosene over the hay, over the wooden walls, creating a perimeter of volatile fuel. "But I can save you, Thomas. I can make sure she doesn't drag you back to whatever hell she came from." The barn door shuddered as Elizabeth hit it from outside. Wood splintered but held. "I don't deserve this," Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," Margaret agreed. She held out the matches to him. "But I love you anyway. Isn't that what love is? Choosing someone even when they don't deserve it?" The door exploded inward, and Elizabeth stood in the opening, her face already healing from the rifle shot. Knitting back together in ways that made Margaret's stomach turn. She looked at them, at the kerosene-soaked barn, and her black eyes narrowed in understanding. "You think fire will stop me?" she asked. "No," Margaret said, "but it will slow you down, and it will destroy whatever hold you have over him. You said there were oaths, rituals, blood magic. Well, blood burns just like everything else." She struck a match. For just a moment, the three of them stood frozen, a tableau of impossible choices and desperate love. Then Margaret dropped the match. The kerosene ignited with a whoosh that sucked the air from Margaret's lungs. Flames raced across the floor, up the walls, turning the barn into an instant inferno. The heat was intense, immediate, and through the fire, Margaret saw Elizabeth's face contort with rage. "You'll burn too, you foolish girl." "I know," Margaret said calmly. Thomas grabbed her hand. "There's a root cellar. In the back corner. We can—" But Elizabeth was moving through the flames, her dress smoking but her body untouched. Whatever she was, fire hurt her but didn't stop her. Her hand shot out, grabbing Thomas by the throat and lifting him off his feet. "You are mine," she snarled. "Bound by blood and bone now and forever." Margaret didn't think. She just acted. She had a pitchfork in her hands. When had she grabbed a pitchfork? And she drove it with all her strength into Elizabeth's back. This time the scream was different. Pain, real pain. Elizabeth dropped Thomas and whirled, the pitchfork protruding from her spine, and Margaret saw genuine fear in those black eyes. "Iron," Elizabeth whispered. Then, louder, angrier, "Iron." The barn was collapsing around them now, support beams burning through and dropping chunks of flaming wood. Thomas grabbed Margaret and half-dragged, half-carried her toward the back corner where the root cellar opened. They tumbled down the earthen stairs together as the barn collapsed behind them, burying Elizabeth in a tomb of burning wood and flame. In the darkness of the root cellar, they clung to each other and listened to the screaming. It went on for a long time, too long for any human to survive. But Elizabeth Blackwood was not human, and her dying was not a human dying. When the screaming finally stopped, when the only sound was the crackle of flames above, Margaret whispered, Is it over? I don't know, Thomas admitted. I don't know what it takes to kill something like her. They stayed in the root cellar for hours, until the fire burned itself out and silence settled over the ruins of Margaret's farm. When they finally climbed out, everything was ash and blackened timber. The barn was gone. The house had caught fire too and was now just a skeleton of charred beams. And in the center of where the barn had stood, they found a body. It was burned beyond recognition, little more than charred bones and ash. But there, still visible among the remains, was a wedding ring, gold, with an intricate pattern of vines and thorns. Thomas stared at it for a long moment. That was hers, he said quietly. That was Elizabeth's ring. Margaret felt no triumph, no sense of victory. She felt only exhausted and empty. Her home was destroyed, her life was in ruins, and the man she loved carried secrets and shadows that would never fully disappear. "What do we do now?" she asked. Thomas looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the same exhaustion, the same emptiness, but also something else, gratitude and love, and a desperate hope. "We run," he said. "We go west, somewhere she can't follow, even if she somehow survived. We start over. I have nothing left to start over with. You have me. If you still want me." Margaret looked at the ruins of her life, at the ashes of everything she had known. Then she looked at Thomas Blackwood, liar and fugitive, haunted man with secrets in his blood. "I must be the biggest fool in America," she said. "Is that a yes?" Despite everything, despite the horror and betrayal and loss, Margaret felt her lips quirk in something almost like a smile. That's a yes. They salvaged what they could from the ruins, which wasn't much. Some tools that had survived in the root cellar. A small amount of money Thomas had hidden in a coffee tin, Margaret's mother's locket, miraculously unmelted in the ashes of the house. By nightfall they were riding west, sharing Thomas's black mare. Margaret didn't look back. There was nothing to look back at except ashes and ghosts. But 3 days later, as they camped in a grove of cottonwood trees, Margaret woke to find Thomas sitting by the fire, staring at something in his hands. "Thomas, what's wrong?" He held up what he was holding and Margaret's blood ran cold. It was the wedding ring, Elizabeth's wedding ring. The one they had left with her burned corpse in Iowa. "It was in my saddlebag," Thomas whispered. "I don't know how. I don't know when. But Margaret, if the ring is here—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both understood. If the ring was Elizabeth Blackwood might not be as dead as they had hoped. And somewhere in the darkness beyond their campfire, Margaret could have sworn she heard the sound of bone-chime laughter carried on the wind. The reckoning. They rode for California because it was as far west as the American continent allowed, because the gold fields had given way to agricultural valleys where two people could disappear into ordinary, hard-working anonymity. For 6 months, they ran. They took new names. Thomas became Samuel Porter, and Margaret became Mary Porter, husband and wife who had come west seeking opportunity like thousands of others. They found work on a ranch outside Sacramento, Thomas as a ranch hand, and Margaret as a cook and housekeeper. For 6 months, they lived in cautious happiness, always watching the horizon, always listening for the sound of hoofbeats that might signal Elizabeth's arrival. But as winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, they began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had truly escaped. The ring had to be a coincidence. Perhaps Thomas had picked it up unconsciously before they fled Iowa. Perhaps Elizabeth had left it in his saddlebag months earlier, during their marriage, and he had simply forgotten about it. There were rational explanations, and Margaret clung to them desperately, but Thomas was having nightmares again. She would wake in their small cabin to find him thrashing in the bed, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, his body covered in cold sweat. Sometimes he would sit bolt upright with a scream caught in his throat, and when she asked him what he had dreamed, he would just shake his head and pull her close, as if physical contact could ward off the darkness. "Tell me," she begged him one night, after a particularly violent nightmare. "Thomas, please. Keeping secrets is what got us into this nightmare in the first place." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I dream that she's calling me, that she's pulling me back, even across all this distance. I can feel her, Margaret. in my blood, in my bones. The oaths I swore to her family, they're not broken. They can't be broken by distance or fire or wishful thinking. What kind of oaths? Thomas got out of bed and went to the window, staring out into the California darkness. Her family. They're not just monsters for the sake of being monstrous. They serve something older. Something that was here long before humans, and will be here long after we're gone. The rituals, the sacrifices, it all feeds this entity. And the men who marry into the family become conduits, vessels. We're bound to it through blood magic, and in return we're given certain protections, long life, freedom from disease, the family's wealth and power. Margaret felt ice crystallize in her veins. So you're telling me that you're not entirely human either? I'm human enough, but there's something else in me now. Something that was put there on my wedding night when Elizabeth cut my palm and her palm and mixed our blood while she spoke words in that ancient language. I felt it enter me, cold and vast and utterly alien. I've been carrying it ever since. Can it be removed? I don't know. I've been searching for a way, but the knowledge is locked away in the family's archives. And even if I could find a way... He turned to look at her, and his eyes were haunted. What if removing it kills me? What if I'm so bound to this entity now that separating us would be like tearing out my soul? Margaret went to him, taking his face in her hands. Then we live with it. We find a way to control it, to keep it from controlling you. But Thomas, you have to stop keeping secrets. I can't fight what I don't understand. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I'm so tired, Margaret. So tired of being afraid. I know, but we're not giving up. We've come too far. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late July. Margaret was in the ranch house kitchen, making bread, when she heard the scream. It came from the barn, high and terrified, and she recognized the voice. Emma, the rancher's 12-year-old daughter. Margaret grabbed a knife and ran. She found Emma backed into a corner of the barn, and standing between her and the door was a woman in a gray dress. Even from behind, Margaret recognized her. The way she held herself, the dark hair, the inhuman stillness. Elizabeth, Margaret said. The woman turned, and Margaret saw that while the face was similar, it wasn't quite the same. This woman was older, or perhaps just looked older, with lines around her eyes and gray streaking through her dark hair. But the eyes themselves, pale blue, almost colorless, were identical to Elizabeth's. Not Elizabeth, the woman said, her voice carrying the same honey-over-broken-glass quality. I'm her mother, Catherine Blackwood. But it's lovely to finally meet the woman who murdered my daughter. Emma whimpered, and Margaret positioned herself between the girl and Catherine. Emma, run to the house. Lock yourself in, and don't come out. I don't think so, Catherine said pleasantly. And suddenly Emma was screaming again because her feet wouldn't move, because she was rooted to the spot as if her boots had grown into the floorboards. I think she should stay and watch. Children should understand what happens when you interfere with matters beyond your comprehension. Margaret raised the knife. Let her go. Or what? You'll stab me? I've been stabbed, dear girl. I've been shot, burned, drowned, and buried alive. I am 347 years old, and in all that time, do you know what I've learned? That human determination is amusing but ultimately futile. Catherine smiled, showing teeth that were just slightly too pointed. Elizabeth was my youngest, my favorite, and you burned her alive. She attacked me. She would have killed me. Probably. But that was her right as Thomas's true wife. You, on the other hand, are nothing but a thief and a murderer. Catherine took a step closer, and Margaret could feel the temperature in the barn dropping, could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. And now you get to learn what happens to women who steal what belongs to the Blackwood family. The knife fell from Margaret's hand, clattered to the floor. Not because Catherine had used magic, but because Margaret's arm had simply gone numb, then her shoulder, spreading like frost across her body. She tried to speak, to scream, but her jaw wouldn't move. She was freezing from the inside out. Stop it, Emma cried. Leave her alone. Catherine glanced at the girl with mild interest. Brave, foolish but brave. The Blackwoods could you. It's girls with courage like yours. Perhaps when you're a little older. Don't you touch her. Margaret managed to force through frozen lips. I'm not touching anyone. I'm simply showing you what real power looks like. Catherine turned her attention back to Margaret. Do you feel it? That cold? That's death, Margaret Hayes. Death slowing your heart, freezing your blood, turning you to ice from the inside. In about 30 seconds you'll be nothing but a frozen corpse, and I'll tell everyone you simply died of a sudden chill. It happens, out here in the West. Margaret's vision was dimming, the edges going dark. She could feel her heart struggling, each beat slower than the last. This was it. This was how she would die, murdered by a 300-year-old witch while a child watched, unable to help. Then she heard his voice. Catherine, stop. Thomas stood in the barn doorway, and there was something different about him, something that made even Catherine Blackwood pause in her killing. His eyes had gone black, completely black, just like Elizabeth's had, and when he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that made the air vibrate. Release her. Now, Catherine's smile widened. There you are. There's the Thomas we bound. I was wondering when you would accept what you truly are. I will never accept it, but I will use it to protect her. Thomas took a step forward, and Margaret felt the killing cold recede slightly, felt her heart beat a little stronger. You can have me, Catherine. I'll come back to Boston. I'll fulfill whatever obligations Elizabeth's death has created. But you leave Margaret alone. You leave this child alone. They have nothing to do with our world. Everything has to do with our world, Catherine said. The mundane and the magical are not separate realms, foolish boy. They bleed into each other, corrupt each other. Your farm girl saw things no ordinary human should see. She used iron against one of us. She knows too much. Then bind her tongue. Cast whatever spell keeps humans from speaking of your family. But let her live. Catherine studied him with those colorless eyes, and Margaret could practically see her weighing options, calculating advantages. Finally, she nodded. Very well. But understand, Thomas, if you break this bargain, if you run again, I will not just kill her, I will make her suffer in ways that will drive her mad before the end finally comes, and I will make you watch. The cold released Margaret all at once, and she collapsed, gasping, her body shaking with relief and residual terror. Emma ran to her, wrapping small arms around her, and Margaret held the girl close while trying to process what had just happened. Thomas had used their power, had called upon whatever entity the Blackwood family served to protect her, and in doing so, he had surrendered himself completely. No, Margaret whispered. Thomas, no. He wouldn't look at her. It's done, Margaret. This is the only way. I won't let you. You don't have a choice. His voice was gentle but final. None of us do. Catherine extended a hand toward Thomas, and after a moment's hesitation he took it. As their palms touched, Margaret saw something pass between them, a shimmer in the air, like heat rising from summer asphalt, and Thomas gasped as if struck. The binding is renewed, Catherine said with satisfaction. Welk. Home, son-in-law. We have much work to do. They left that afternoon. Catherine had arrived with a coach and driver, a silent man who might have been human but probably wasn't, and Thomas gathered his few possessions with mechanical efficiency. He didn't speak, didn't meet Margaret's eyes, and when she tried to talk to him, he just shook his head. At the coach, Catherine paused to address Margaret one final time. The spell I've placed on you will keep you from speaking of our family to anyone who doesn't already know of us. Don't fight it. The more you struggle against it, the more it will hurt. She smiled that terrible smile. Consider it a mercy. Margaret wanted to spit in her face, to claw those two pale eyes from their sockets, but Thomas was already in the coach, already lost to her, and violence would only make things worse. Can I say goodbye to him? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Catherine considered, then nodded. 1 minute. Make it count. Margaret climbed into the coach where Thomas sat, his face turned toward the window. She took his hand, and he finally looked at her. I'm so sorry, he whispered. For all of it. For lying, for bringing this nightmare into your life, for not being strong enough to break free. Don't, Margaret said fiercely. Don't apologize for loving me. That's the one thing in this whole mess that was real. Was it, though? Or was I just using you to run from my obligations? His eyes, human again now, storm gray and swimming with tears, searched hers desperately. How do you even know my love was genuine and not just another manipulation? Margaret thought about the question, really thought about it. Then he smiled, sad and certain. Because I can tell the difference between a man playing a part and a man letting himself be seen. You let me see you, Thomas Blackwood. The broken, frightened, desperate parts. That wasn't manipulation, that was trust. He pulled her close, kissing her with a desperation that tasted like goodbye. When they broke apart, he pressed something into her hand, a piece of paper, folded small. Don't read it now, he said. Wait until we're gone. And Margaret, forget about me. Find someone good, someone whole, someone who can give you the life you deserve. That's not how love works. I know. But I can hope. Catherine appeared at the coach door. Time's up. Margaret climbed out, the folded paper clutched in her fist. She watched the coach pull away, watched Thomas's face in the window until it was too far to see. The rancher and his family had emerged from the house, drawn by the commotion, and Emma stood beside her father with tears streaming down her face. I don't understand what just happened, the rancher said. Mary, who were those people? Margaret opened her mouth to explain, to tell him everything, and felt her throat close up, felt pain lance through her skull like hot iron. The binding spell. She tried again, tried to force the words out, but the pain intensified until she thought her head might split open. Catherine had been thorough. Old debts, she finally managed to say. Samuel had old debts. It was close enough to the truth that the spell allowed it. The rancher looked unsatisfied but didn't press. Margaret excused herself and walked back to her cabin, each step feeling like she was wading through deep water. Inside, with the door closed and locked, she finally unfolded the paper Thomas had given her. It was covered in his neat handwriting, and as she read, she understood that this was his final gift to her, information he should never have shared. Knowledge that put her in even more danger but also gave her the only weapon that might matter. Margaret, if you're reading this, then Catherine has taken me back. I don't expect you to do anything with this information. In fact, I hope you'll burn this letter and never think of me again. But I know you well enough to understand you won't. You're too stubborn, too brave, too unwilling to let the monsters win. So here is what I've learned about the Blackwood family in my years of captivity and research. They serve an entity they call the Sleeping King, something ancient that exists in a place between life and death, between this world and somewhere else. Every 13 years on the autumn equinox, they perform a ritual that feeds it power drawn from sacrificial deaths. This sustains both the entity and the family's unnatural longevity and abilities. But there's a weakness. The entity is bound to the physical location of the original Blackwood house in Boston. If that house were destroyed, if the foundation stones were broken, the binding would weaken enough that the entity might be driven back to wherever it came from. The family would lose their power, their immortality, everything. The house is at 47 Marlborough Street in Boston. The foundation stones are marked with symbols. You'll know them when you see them, they hurt to look at. They must be broken during the ritual itself, when the entity is most present and therefore most vulnerable. The next ritual is October 22nd, 1884. 13 months from now. I don't expect you to do anything with this information. The very idea of you facing the entire Blackwood family is insane. But I wanted you to know that there is a way to fight back, should you ever choose to. You gave me something I never thought I'd have, hope. Real, genuine hope that a better life was possible. Even though it didn't work out, even though I'm returning to darkness, I want you to know that knowing you, loving you, was the most human I've ever felt. Be safe. Be happy. Forget about me. All my love, Thomas. Margaret read the letter 3 times, committing every detail to memory. Then she did exactly what Thomas had known she would do, what her stubborn, survivor's nature demanded. She began to plan. The next 13 months were the hardest of Margaret's life. She continued working at the ranch, saving every penny, every dollar. She told no one about her plans. The binding spell wouldn't allow it anyway. Instead, she researched and prepared in secret. She learned about iron's properties, about why it affected the Blackwood family. She discovered that iron disrupted magical energies, acted as a barrier to supernatural forces. She acquired iron nails, iron chains, an iron crowbar that she filed to a sharp edge. She practiced with them until she could work with iron tools in her sleep. She studied maps of Boston, memorized the layout of Marlborough Street, planned her approach to the house. She corresponded under a false name with historical societies, learned about the Blackwood family's public history, their charity work, their social prominence, why had been part of Boston's elite for generations. And she thought about Thomas, wondered if he was still alive, if he was being forced to participate in whatever horrors the family required. The not knowing was its own special torture. 8 months into her preparations, a letter arrived. It had no return address, and the handwriting was shaky, uncertain, but Margaret recognized it immediately. I don't have much time. They watch me constantly, but I managed to bribe a servant to post this. Don't come to Boston. Whatever you're planning, and I know you're planning something, don't do it. The family has grown suspicious since my return. They know you survived, and they're watching for any sign that you might act against them. Catherine has been teaching me their rituals, preparing me to take Elizabeth's place in the family hierarchy. The things I've seen, the things I've been forced to participate in. I can't write about them. The horror of it would break you. But I need you to know that I haven't forgotten you. In my darkest moments, I think about you, and it keeps me human, keeps me from surrendering completely to the darkness. Please, Margaret, let me go. Save yourself. T. Margaret burned the letter as she had burned Thomas's first one, but not before copying down every word. If anything, the letter only strengthened her resolve. Thomas was suffering, was being corrupted day by day, and she was possibly the only person in the world who knew the family's weakness and was willing to act on it. 3 months before the ritual, she sold everything she owned. She told the rancher and his family that her husband had died back east, and she needed to return home to settle his affairs. They were sad to see her go, especially Emma, who had become like a daughter to Margaret. "Will you come back?" Emma asked, as Margaret prepared to board the train east. Margaret looked at the girl's hopeful face and wanted to lie, wanted to promise that she'd return and everything would be fine. But she had learned that lies, even comforting ones, had consequences. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but Emma, I need you to remember something. Never let anyone tell you that being brave means not being afraid. Brave means being terrified and doing the right thing anyway. Can you remember that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I'll remember." The train journey from Sacramento to Boston took 5 days. Margaret spent them in a haze of preparation and dread, going over her plan again and again, looking for flaws and finding them everywhere. What she was attempting was suicidal. The Blackwood family was ancient, powerful, protected by forces beyond human comprehension. She was one woman with iron tools and desperate determination. But she had something they didn't. She had nothing left to lose. Boston in October was gray and cold, the air sharp with the promise of coming winter. Margaret found a boarding house near Marlborough Street and spent 3 weeks watching the Blackwood mansion, learning its rhythms and routines. The house was exactly as imposing as she'd imagined, a 4-story brownstone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Servants came and went, deliveries were made, but the family members themselves were rarely seen during the day. They emerged only at night, pale figures in dark clothing that moved with that characteristic, inhuman grace. She saw Thomas once briefly getting into a carriage. He looked older, or perhaps just more tired, and there was something in his posture, a defeated slump to his shoulders, that made Margaret's heart ache. She wanted to call out to him, to let him know she was there, but the element of surprise was her only real advantage. The night of October 22nd came cold and clear, the moon a thin crescent providing minimal light, perfect conditions for what Margaret needed to do. She waited until midnight, then made her approach. The house had guards, but they were human, hired men who knew nothing of what their employers truly were. Margaret had learned to move quietly in her frontier years, and she slipped past them easily, scaling the garden wall and crossing to a basement window she had identified as her entry point. The window was locked, but her iron crowbar made short work of it. She climbed through into darkness, landing in what smelled like a root cellar. Her heart was pounding so hard she was certain it would give her away, but she forced herself to breathe slowly. to stay calm. The basement was a maze of stone corridors and locked doors. She moved through it carefully, feeling along the walls, following the faint sound of chanting that echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. The ritual had already begun. She found the ritual chamber behind a door marked with symbols that made her eyes water when she looked at them directly. Margaret gripped her iron crowbar tighter and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, impossibly vast, larger than the house's foundation should have allowed. It was carved from black stone that seemed to drink light. And in the center, surrounded by candles and drawn symbols, stood the Blackwood family. There were perhaps 20 of them, all dressed in black robes, their faces hidden by hoods. They stood in a circle around an altar where a young woman lay bound, no more than 16, eyes wide with terror. And behind the altar, rising from the floor like smoke-given substance, was something that hurt to perceive. The sleeping king wasn't sleeping anymore. It had no definite form. It shifted and changed, sometimes humanoid, sometimes insectoid, sometimes just a roiling mass of shadows and teeth and too many eyes. Looking at it made Margaret's mind rebel, made her want to laugh or scream or simply curl up and surrender to the madness of it. But she had come too far to stop now. She scanned the room looking for Thomas and found him standing in the circle, his face visible beneath his hood. His eyes were closed, his lips moving in the ancient chanting, and Margaret realized with horror that he was an active participant now. Whatever resistance he'd had was gone, worn away by months of corruption. The foundation stones. She had to find the foundation stones. They were there, built into the walls of the chamber, large rectangular blocks carved with those symbols that hurt to see. There were 4 of them, one in each cardinal direction. Margaret would need to break all 4 during the ritual itself to disrupt the binding. She started with the eastern stone, swinging her iron crowbar with all her strength. The impact sent shockwaves up her arms, and the symbols on the stone flared bright red. The chanting faltered. Catherine's voice rose above the others. "Intruder! The farm girl has seek Om to play hero." Laughter echoed through the chamber, cold and mocking, but Margaret was already moving to the southern stone, striking it again and again. Cracks appeared in the ancient rock, and the entity in the center of the room let out a sound like metal scraping on metal. Hands grabbed her from behind, cold hands, inhumanly strong. Margaret twisted free, swinging the crowbar wildly, and felt it connect with something that shrieked. Iron. They hated iron. She used that, keeping the crowbar moving, making it impossible for them to approach without risking contact with the metal. She reached the western stone and struck it 3 times in rapid succession. It shattered, and the entity screamed, a sound so terrible that blood trickled from Margaret's ears. The air in the chamber began to shimmer and warp. "Stop her," Catherine commanded. "She's breaking the binding." They came at her all at once, too many to fight, too fast to evade. Margaret managed one more strike at the northern stone before they overwhelmed her. She went down beneath a mass of bodies, feeling ribs crack, tasting blood. "Foolish girl," Catherine hissed in her ear. "Did you really think you could win? One human woman against the power of the sleeping king?" Margaret spat blood. "I didn't need to win. I just needed to weaken you." Because she had broken 3 of the 4 foundation stones, and that was apparently enough. The entity was thrashing now, its form becoming less substantial, more transparent. The bindings that held it were failing. "No!" Catherine's scream was rage and terror combined. "Repair the stones, quickly!" But it was too late. The entity was being pulled backward, dragged away from this reality and toward wherever it had originally come from. It reached out with appendages made of shadow and nothing, trying to anchor itself, and Margaret watched in horror as it grabbed one of the hooded figures. Thomas. He was yanked toward the entity, his scream cutting through the chaos, and Margaret saw his hood fall back to reveal his face, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent plea. The entity was pulling him in, using him as an anchor to remain in this world. Margaret didn't think. She just moved. She tore free from the hands holding her, grabbed her iron crowbar, and threw herself between Thomas and the entity. The cold when she made contact was worse than anything Catherine had done to her. This was the cold of absolute zero, of the void between stars, of death itself. But it recoiled from the iron in her hands. Margaret swung the crowbar at the appendage holding Thomas, and where the iron touched, the shadow flesh dissolved. Thomas fell free, and Margaret caught him, dragging him backward as the entity writhed and shrieked. "The Northern Stone!" she yelled at Thomas. "Break the Northern Stone!" He stared at her, not comprehending, and she realized that whatever they had done to him over the past months had broken something fundamental. He was lost, trapped somewhere in his own mind. So Margaret did the only thing she could think of. She kissed him. It was desperate and bloody and probably stupid, but she poured everything she had into it. All her love, all her fear, all her stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. And somewhere in that kiss, Thomas came back to him's elf. She felt it happen, felt him return from wherever his mind had fled. He pulled away, looked at her with sudden clarity, and understood what needed to be done. They moved together, husband and wife in truth if not in law, and struck the Northern Foundation stone in perfect unison. It shattered, and the entity let out one final scream before being pulled completely from this reality. The air in the chamber imploded with a sound like thunder, and then silence. The candles had all gone out. The symbols on the floor were dark, and the Blackwood family stood frozen, their faces showing the first signs of mortality, wrinkles appearing,